Hello, all you miracles and warriors and healing out there. I am coming to you today with another video to continue the series that I've been doing on healing ritualized abuse, mind control, and other really intense experiences like incest and human trafficking that result in dissociative identity disorder or DDNOS or OSDD. So you know that we've been pretty much focusing the whole series on talking about managing, understanding, alters, parts, different fragments of our mind that are created when really intense trauma is happening to us, especially at a really early age, developmentally. And then once this pattern has been set in your brain, it's something that will continue to happen throughout your life when you're put under extreme stress and traumatic circumstances. So, the main thing that we need to talk about today when it comes to memory processing is the fact that we are talking about a form of PTSD when it comes to everything that you're dealing with when it comes to the really difficult to manage symptoms and mental health issues. All of that stuff is really a PTSD, a post-traumatic stress reaction that we're dealing with. A lot of times they'll consider it CPTSD when it comes to what we've experienced, which is ongoing trauma throughout childhood. It's not a single event. Many people in the world at large understand PTSD if you're talking about, say, a soldier or someone coming back from war, where it's during the duration of their time in war, they've had several really intense, above the norm traumatic experiences, and then can come back essentially where you're dealing with a lot of symptoms mentally because of what you've had to endure and survive. Now, the important thing to realize here is that when we're talking about this kind of more isolated, or it's like a shorter term basically of someone's life and they were an adult, everyone can kind of in society kind of be understanding and give them a pass, almost not as they should, but essentially they can understand when these people are going through flashbacks, going through difficulty adjusting to normality, dealing with addictions, dealing with difficulty in having relationships or a normal home life. That is in our society somewhat accepted. But when it comes to people that are survivors of child abuse or extreme child abuse, a lot of times there's a lot less societal understanding of how intense that can be or how it can really show up in the survivors' lives. So much of what we're focusing on here is, memory work. Is that, if you're a survivor of war, if you're the survivor of maybe an isolated sexual abuse, incident like rape or something as an adult, or a really traumatic car accident, all of these things, it's something that in general there's a lot of resources out there for understanding for the survivors of those things. There are more and more resources now for survivors of child trafficking or extreme incest or ritual abuse. But in general, my whole point for making this channel was to kind of have like a introductory, understandable, beginner's idea on how to conceptualize healing intense experiences of this magnitude, especially when so many of them, the bulk of them, happened when we were children and didn't really have the capacity for really understanding what we were going through or how to manage our symptoms afterwards. So it's really characterized by dissociating all of those emotions, all of the content of those events and everything, and essentially isolating them in pockets in our brain basically so that we could continue to survive, function, and develop quote unquote normally, what would appear normally to the outside world as we continue to grow. Now in adulthood, and that's why a lot of you are probably finding my channel, what we end up finding is that these things that we were able to suppress as children, start bubbling to the surface. You're gonna have issues with like triggers with it comes to when it comes to things in your normal life that are perhaps reminiscent, whether situations or like 5 sense factors, basically, where it's like a smell, a sound, someone's behavior, a sight that maybe you see in a movie or something that's very similar to what you went through as a child. Then those are especially times where suddenly you can start having those trauma pockets like open up in your brain in adulthood, especially for a lot of people in like their late 20s and 30s. When we're in more stable situations, our brain starts bringing these things up for us to actually acknowledge and handle. And what we'll find is this is very much where you start experiencing a lot of flashbacks, basically. And the flashbacks are really difficult to manage. Like most people will understand, if you're a survivor, you can experience a lot of the functionality in your life going down. Suddenly, things that you could put away out of your mind and in the past and just focus on, work, life, all of these other things, it becomes much more difficult, essentially, to do that. So as you know, I typically like having visual aids. So from this point forward, today we're going to be using my memory processing and flashbacks flowchart. Where we're going to start with here is, I'll bring this closer here. So usually, kind of what I was just talking about, this is kind of like an idea of like a little graph of like the emotional intensity that you could be going through when experiencing triggers in your life and starting to experience flashbacks of the trauma that you experienced in childhood. And usually it's going to start with a trigger, essentially, and then this graph kind of shows the level of like emotional intensity, that the intensity of like the symptoms of the flashback that you're going to be going through. A lot of times you'll experience the trigger and you'll have essentially almost these like humps, basically, which are going to be characterized by step number 1, which is the symptoms of the flashback, basically, where you're getting a little bit of information about why it is you're feeling the way you're feeling, why it is you're suddenly starting to feel like, despite things being fine in your normal life, you're actually feeling more and more like you're almost repeating an event from the past, just like a war victim having, flashbacks where they feel like suddenly they're in the war zone again. It's going to be that same kind of experience. And usually it's something that will come up and then you can kind of manage and subdue a little bit, and then more will come up and you'll try and subdue it and push it away again. That's what these dips are, until finally it's like the symptoms become more and more insistent until your level of intensity with the flashback peaks to where you're really not as present with reality as you would like to be. Usually it's going to be characterized by a lot of emotional upset, sometimes body pains and stuff like that. And what I have here is kind of characterizing this period as of a PTSD flashback is blending. So it's essentially where you're living in 2 different realities as a survivor. So what you're experiencing is the fact that you are, you're living with your normal conscious life, your normal day-to-day life. But in addition to this, it's like you have an overlay, almost like a tinted pair of glasses or something, an overlay of the past experience that you went through during childhood, that is kind of blending with your current reality once the trigger has happened. And why this is so difficult, is because we tend to discount our feelings as survivors. We don't really approach ourselves with compassion. We might feel like I'm overreacting, I'm being stupid, We don't really want to start processing it. And a lot of it is because, one, we want to keep doing what we've been doing, which is just to move forward and not be looking back on the past at all. but two, because we're having the blending of the consciousness of a child part as well as our adult consciousness. And the child part that is kind of bringing up the flashback from that trauma pocket, for them, it does feel like, you know, when you're having a flashback, it does feel like you are about to be experiencing that same really horrific traumatic event all over again. And you're also going to have those accompanying feelings that you are when you had when you were a kid, that the situation is inescapable, unmanageable, you know, that there's no foreseeable end in sight, you know. So getting ourselves to lower the emotional intensity that we're feeling and come back to the present and back to normalcy is going to be about intentionally bringing our adult mind into this, to essentially start processing the memory and really integrating the content of the memory, whether it's, you know, the emotions, the actual physical content of what was happening, all of that. We really want to make sure that we're at this point consciously and intentionally like blending those consciousnesses to essentially, you know, help out that child part into realizing that we're in a place of safety. If you're going through a flashback, this is going to sound like a lot of words, and like something, it really on a certain level will be sound rational. Sorry, it'll sound rational, but it will also feel somewhat impossible, because really, you know, when we're experiencing the flashbacks, like that does feel like the current reality, even though it's something that has happened in the past. So that's why I have this flow chart here that kind of hopefully will give people some guidance and some knowledge about where they are in healing and what they're going through, especially if we're dealing with flashbacks. It can hopefully create some grounding and some reassurance that this is not permanent. You know, the state that you're in, this feeling of intense mental chaos, or that you're out of control or overwhelmed, essentially, that is a normal part of the process of dealing with flashbacks. And we have to usually start with acknowledging it, and then things will start to get better. Okay, so let me see if I can bring this a little closer. Sorry, I'm just realizing how reflective a whiteboard is in the future. I probably won't be using it anymore. It probably doesn't make things very easy to read. But regardless, I'm going to be going over everything with you right now. So, why this cycle of the flashback? And this step number one is essentially the flashback. You know, you being in the reliving of a past traumatic event. Now, why it has this kind of like cyclical nature to it is because most of the time when we're dealing with flashbacks, you're not going to be dealing with all of the information of what you went through at once. It's usually going to be one of these things here. It's going to be one of these things here, essentially, that comes up first. It's not always the same thing. In my experience, a lot of times it's the emotional flashback, you know, but other times it'll start with body memories or flashes or some intrusive thoughts and urges, basically. It really depends on kind of which part has dissociated the experience and what the particular trigger is of that flashback memory. And then that is going to be a lot of times what determines like where you're going to start on this cycle. But usually you are going to cycle between one of these things where it starts off with, and you're going to go through all four of these things during an emotion or during a flashback. So we're just going to start at the top. Flashes. A lot of times survivors experience this as a got a lot of bird friends here. A lot of times survivors experience this as essentially like this is going to be the actual like narrative content of what went on. It's either going to be a repetitive sound maybe it's someone saying something, or maybe you hearing screaming, maybe you hearing something related essentially to what was actually occurring in the memory, or visual flashes. Now, sometimes this can be almost feel like hallucinations, where almost the part that's coming up will consistently show you in your mind's eye or almost in reality a snapshot picture of the memory content that they hold, essentially. Most of the time, any of these, especially the first one, is going to be very repetitive. Like I said, this is kind of the graph here where we have these humps. A lot of times we're going to start getting one of these, getting the information, and we're going to try to, as a defense mechanism, re-dissociate that information. We're going to try and take that information and push it away. It's uncomfortable, it feels really scary, really intimidating, and something like we can't handle, very overwhelming, so we're going to try and push it away. But once that part that has had their trauma bubble open, they really are interested in some integration and healing. They're calling out for help. So what you'll find is it's almost like a kid expressing a need. First it's like mom, then it's mom, then it's mom, then it's mom, then it's mom. That's what it's going to be like. Usually it's like our adult selves are going to try and push it away, and that child part is going to become more and more insistent, essentially, with repetition and sometimes intensity, to where you're going to be getting that coming up over and over. In my experience, the more we push the flashbacks away and try not to process them, the more intense this hump can become, essentially. The more intense you will get to in a level of emotional and physical intensity, it's like fighting it. The more energy you put to fight it, to push it away, usually the more insistent it will become. So we have the flashes, which is the audio and visual stuff. We also have body memories. So this is going to be like the physical sensations that you were experiencing during the trauma event. With body memories, what you're going to be experiencing is literal, pains, especially that are associated with the event. If you experienced, rape, then that means that you can be experiencing those same level of pain, or like post-rape feelings, of like crampiness, soreness, etc. You can have muscle aches and pains, pain in your back or joints, essentially, depending on what you went through. If you were experiencing like mind control or more organized abuse, you might even be experiencing symptoms of like almost that feel seizure-like, of electric shock memories and stuff like that. So body memories really run the gamut. I even one time had, when I was having some ritual abuse memories coming up, where I was a small child that had been forced to perform a ritual in front of an altar that was in front of a bonfire, repeatedly had the feeling that my shins were burning, were on fire, because when I was a child, I was close enough to the fire that I felt that intensity of heat, of almost sunburn and, burningness of my lower legs because of the proximity of the fire. So then in adulthood, even though I'm sitting on the couch, I'm nowhere near a fire, I'll have those same sensations, essentially. So it can really vary. So the emotional flashbacks are a lot of times part of this same blending mechanism, where especially if that's the first thing you're feeling, it's like suddenly you might be feeling very depressed, very angry, very full of grief. There's a lot of different emotions that you could be feeling, and it won't feel appropriate to where you are at in your current life. It won't feel appropriate to you'll be like, I'm safe, life is good, but instead you have this feeling of, the world is about to end, and really overwhelming anxiety, maybe a lot of fear. Those are the emotional flashbacks, essentially. So the emotional content of that trauma memory. Then we also have the intrusive thinking and urges, and these can be the repetitive thoughts of almost like what your child part wishes they could have done at the time, you know. So it might be an urge to run away, like an overwhelming urge to run away, an overwhelming urge to fight, you know, maybe an overwhelming urge to suppress stuff with addictions that, you know, from eating to, you know, substance abuse or something like that. Or even I would put like the feelings of suicidality a lot of times in this category, where essentially it's going to be a normal response to a child that's going through an overwhelming thing, especially if it's ritualized abuse and it's something that you've gone through many times and foresee going through many times in the future, you know, or like, and that anticipation of something really horrible happening. As a child, it can be very normal to have this suicidal ideation, you know, this idea of like escape through self-harm, essentially. Or you could be dealing with that because you might have dealt with organized abuse, in which case it's something possibly your abusers intentionally implanted as thoughts or ideas in your head, because they knew at some point that you were going to be dealing with these memories, and they would rather that we just, you know, commit self-harm essentially and either actually kill ourselves or get ourselves into a mental institution to essentially purposely either remove ourselves from the equation of, you know, remove ourselves from the equation of being able to spill the secrets of the crimes they committed, or to essentially discredit ourselves by acting crazy, you know, or unstable. Also, intrusive thinking can really just be like repetitive thoughts, you know, over and over again that don't make sense in your current life, that are totally out of context, and they're really just maybe thoughts that you thought that you were thinking as a child at the time, you know, going through a traumatic event, you know, could be something like, you know, I'm unlovable, or, you know, my mom doesn't love me, or my dad doesn't love me. It could be, I just wish I was somewhere else. Like it could be a lot of different things, you know, but it will usually be characterized by repetitiveness and something that's not appropriate to your current life. Okay, it's getting a little cold out here, so I'm going to take a quick break before we move on to how we manage these flashbacks and get out of this cycle. Because like I said, all of this will continue, essentially almost like dominoes, to trigger each other, and it will increase in intensity and how often it's repeating while we're trying to push it away mentally. So the best thing that we can do to get out of this cycle is to start doing something to acknowledge and bring that into consciousness. But like I said, it's getting a little cold, so I'm gonna throw on my sweater real quick. Hopefully my voice doesn't keep shaking. It's always difficult to talk about these subjects, obviously. So I try my hardest not to use so many filler words, but it happens. So I try and just be very kind and compassionate towards myself as I'm trying to describe these horrible things that can happen to children. Okay, so the first step is always going to be externalize and acknowledge what we are thinking, going through, feeling, etc. It's going to feel often to that child part even like this is going to be this first step into making this past event a current reality, but it's really going to be the opposite of what happens. When we start externalizing and acknowledging stuff, it's going to be validating that part's experience, and it's also going to be showing the part that we can mentally start processing this without it actually in reality repeating in our current life. So how do we do this? This is going to be what I talk about many times, have talked about many times, and I will continue to talk about because it's so important, and that is journal and draw. So you're going to be externalizing or paint, whatever it is, you know, maybe even collage. It's going to be about giving a real external voice to that child part that went through this traumatic event. So this is going to have a couple of different effects. One is it's going to create that validation and that proof to that part that things are different now and that they're not going to be repeating the same situation. But also it's literally going to be taking that information out of the emotional part of your brain it's been stuck in for so long, and it's going to be placing it as we move our hands. It's going to be placing it into the logic part of our brain, like Kathy O'Brien and her helper Mark Phillips have talked about many times in their work. It's actually going to be shifting that information from one hemisphere to the other, and it's going to be bringing it into present reality and into our logic brain, to where we can start processing it and seeing that we were a kid, we were helpless, but that now we're adults and we can actually begin to handle all the things that we had to dissociate and suppress as children. So step number 4 is going to be the result of this, which is increased clarity and conscious awareness. So this is a lot of times what a lot of survivors are asking for. A lot of times when you've dealt with a lot of amnesia around your past, you maybe have huge chunks of time that are blanks, maybe even a whole childhood that's mostly a blank, this is what a lot of people are actually asking for when it comes to asking about memory work and stuff. Is they're like, how do I get past the amnesia? How do I actually understand what happened to me and why I have all these symptoms? Well, in all honesty, it's not something we can force. It's something that is going to come naturally as a result of having triggers, having those trauma pockets open, and choosing, to investigate what's going on. We have to be honest that a lot of times we're going to be stuck in this mode, sometimes for years, where essentially we say we want to know what happened to us, but because it feels so overwhelming, so dark, it's filled with so much grief and pain, that we deep down actually don't want the information. We are letting our kid brain still take over and convince us that we are not in a place where we can handle it, or that we are going to be manifesting this into our current reality just by looking and asking the questions. So when survivors ask about how they get through the amnesia, it's this step here, and it requires you to essentially really deal with a lot of the content of the memory, choose to face it, externalize and acknowledge it, and then journal, draw, paint, collage, do whatever you need to do to get some full awareness of what's going on. And what you're going to find is the answers to the questions you've been asking are going to start happening. And what you'll find too is that as you start really working on this process, making it something that you're very maybe not comfortable with, because it's always uncomfortable, but something that you're at least willing to do, what you're going to find is early in healing, that beginning part of blending can last a really long time, like we said, sometimes for years. But what you'll find is as you continue to practice addressing it and processing this stuff, you're going to get into a groove within your internal system with your parts, to where you're going to be shortening this time of blending and intensity of flashbacks more and more each time you choose to process a memory. When I was starting out in healing, it really was like it took what felt like some of like the least traumatic things that were the first things I dealt with, really felt like they took forever to process. But by continually to show up as the adult part of myself to the child parts of my system, there was a certain level of trust that was gained, but then also a certain kind of like groove you can get into, a certain flow that you can get into, so that as you begin dealing with more and more flashbacks through your healing, that you're spending less time pushing away, more time towards it and trying to help and rescue that part. And what you're going to find is it's going to keep shortening the amount of time that you're stuck in the flashback, keep shortening the intensity, of the flashback, to where it's something that you can, As soon as you start feeling that, you know, that blending that doesn't feel appropriate to your current life, you can start to say, hey, you can acknowledge suddenly, oh my gosh, like this is a flashback that I'm dealing with. And you can just go and pick up the pen, pick up the paintbrush, pick up, you know, the doodling, the collage, whatever it is you need. You just acknowledge it and you just pick that up, start working on it. And what you're going to find is you're going to gain more and more confidence in your healing that you can actually handle this no matter how intense and horrible it feels every time the flashback comes up. You can essentially be shortening the duration of that intensity that you're feeling, you know, and how much you see it disrupting your life in the present. So, number 5 is going to be memory work. So now once we have some understanding of what we went through as a kid and why it is we're feeling the feelings we are around the flashbacks, it can be like, what do we do to feel better? You know, you don't want to just be like stuck in a place of like understanding the horrors you went through. Like, you need to know what to do about it to really show up for that child part and to really rescue them essentially from the horrors, you know, that you went through as a kid. So this is going to be, with memory work, it's going to be what I consider rewriting the past. It's something I learned in EMDR therapy. So what it's really about is choosing to have your adult self, you know, re-enter the memory as you understand it. And through visualization, what you're going to be doing is choosing to be the savior that you needed at that time. And this is also where it can really come in handy if you're working or have made parts, you know, in the past, allies that are like protector parts and stuff like that. Sometimes it won't even be what I see as like, you know, my main front self that is going to be entering the memory space and trying to rescue the child part from it. From the horrible experience. Sometimes it's going to be, you know, the parts that felt more protectory, more comfortable with violence and intensity or stuff like that, to where you're going to have whatever that part needs showing up in that moment, you know. So sometimes a part just wishes like maybe a social worker had showed up, you know, and just like rescued you. Sometimes they're going to wish, you know, maybe some cops had arrived and had like, you know, arrested the bad guys, you know, the people that were creating all of the trauma and harm. Sometimes it's going to be, you know, and because we're just talking about visualization here, sometimes it's going to be that you see a part that essentially is comfortable with, you know, protective violence and righteous anger, like coming in and actually fighting, you know, or doing something to you know, harm and physically subdue your abusers in that moment. You know, if you need to visualize for that kid that you know, if you're dealing with a gang rape or something like that, or a ritual where there's already a lot of violence or innocence being harmed, you know, if you need to visualize in that instance that one of your protector parts was allowed to come in and handle the situation in a way that really fully subdued the abusers, you know, and, you know, took them out, you know, whether that's, you know, incapacitating them or whatever, in a way that, you know, they should have been because of the horrible crimes that they were committing, then do it. You know, this is visualization. This is whatever it is that part needs to feel like they were rescued from the situation. And then the other part I have for this memory work is action. So it's also about really proving to that part that we're not in the same place. So what you're going to be doing is making sure to, if that part felt like they needed to run and escape, or like they needed to fight, if they needed to tell someone what was going on, then actually do those things, you know, like in your real current life, you know, find someone that you can tell about the crimes that were committed to you. If you felt like you needed to run, like literally do some running, or if you can manage it, do like a vacation or staycation or something to really reinforce to that part that you're in a safe place and you can do this in a positive, non-destructive manner. If it's fight, get a punching bag or and hit the crap out of it with like a bat or your fists, as long as they're well protected, or beat the crap out of your bed with a pillow, or smash some plates or something. Do something that is going to actually physically acknowledge what that part needed at the time, and show them that you're in a place now not of helplessness but ability to do whatever it is you really need to protect yourself. Get involved in a self-defense course if it's something that would feel beneficial to those child parts. These are all like great things, and it really is not all of the things you could be doing. Okay, so number 6 is where we're at here, where you're going to be experiencing the cycle intensity decrease, and this is going to be the benefits of all of your hard work deciding to really show up for those parts, really decide to process these memories, is that you're going to start finally feeling like you are living in the present again and moving out of the flashback and into a clearer mind. And that's not just your adult self, but the child self at this point is now going to be part of the more conscious part of the system, where they also feel that same level of safety and understanding that you are in a different place now. And that's what number 7 is. So, and that's calm and, sorry, I can't read backwards right now. Okay. Calm and grounding in the present. So when you get to number 7, that's the end of a flashback. Usually, if you've decided to like really process it and do the memory work, is that you are going to come back to a place of calm, clarity, feeling once again very grounded in the present. You are going to have additional knowledge. You're going to have additional knowledge, clarity, and awareness of what happened to you in the past as a child. And there probably will still be maybe some lingering grief or something to deal with. But the most important thing is that you're going to experience an increase in functionality, an increase in how you're feeling emotionally. Body memories should all be gone, so you won't be feeling the physical pain anymore, and all the intrusive thoughts and flashes and stuff like that will not be there anymore. The one caveat I will say about step number 7 is that sometimes, especially if you have dealt with with organized crime, people that are aware of how this abuse functions and can come up later on, is sometimes at this point you will experience the introduction of denial parts, essentially, where a lot of times initially in those humps we're going to be dealing with them, where essentially we're trying to convince ourselves that either we're crazy and it didn't happen, or we're going to be just mentally trying to push it away and just stay in the present without getting any of that knowledge that is bubbling to the surface. What you're going to experience sometimes if you've dealt with organized abuse, ritual abuse, and mind control, is that this is the point when sometimes you're going to start dealing more with a denial part stepping in that is going to attempt to redissociate everything that you just did. This is normal. They're just doing their job, so we have to thank them for being able to get us to this point in our lives without totally going insane, or harming ourselves in like worse ways or something like that, because ultimately they're a big part of why we were able to survive. And we have to just acknowledge that if you went through ritual abuse and mind control, this is probably something you're going to be dealing with then. Despite everything you just went through, processing the emotion, this is when the denial parts will come up, trying to redissociate things as a defense mechanism, because that's what they were trained to do by very knowledgeable and skilled abusers and programmers. This is the point when they're going to step in, typically because of the fact that the emotional intensity has decreased and all this stuff is that on a certain level, it will make it easier to feel like, okay, I was just overacting and none of that was real. I'm just crazy because we're not feeling that same level of intensity. But in reality, if you've gone through all of the steps of the flashback, if you've gone through all of the steps of the processing, you can choose to feed into that part and to push that stuff away. But ultimately, what you know based off of your journals, based off of body memories, based off of all of that stuff, is that there was complete validity to everything that you dealt with, and that this is just a part that essentially was very highly traumatized and trained to essentially play this role in the system in an attempt to protect us and our body by obeying what the abusers wanted of us. So this is where I really want to encourage you to, if this is something you're dealing with, to just try and extend compassion towards yourself and to just essentially treat this denial part, in the same way that you did the flashback, which is that you can continue to go through the same steps with this part of journaling, and having this conversation, externalizing this conversation that if it's left internally is going to continue to gain force, is going to feed into the denial and the redissociation. So what we need to do is essentially have the conversation between the adult parts of ourselves and the child parts that have just dealt with this memory, and have the conversation with the denial part in our journals, essentially, as a back and forth, to essentially acknowledge their role and why it is they feel like they're going to be helping us as a system, as a body, to survive, but also to show them, with our adult mind, why it is this is actually going to decrease our functionality over time. It's essentially not valid. Obviously, this is something the abusers have tricked us into doing, and it's not something that's coming inherently from ourselves. So we acknowledge that part, we extend compassion towards them, but we also have to, take them seriously and have take ourselves seriously and have the conversation to work through these feelings of wanting to just, err on the side of we're just crazy, none of this ever happened, So I want to normalize that aspect of things. I think that's pretty much everything I have with the memory work as a complete process. As always, I'm going to try to continue to put out more and more videos where I can break all of these things down more and more. I'm really going to try and do a Q&A here sometime soon, because I've gotten so many amazing questions from the viewers and the subscribers when it comes to how to handle specific issues in healing and everything. So I really would like to address those. I originally did it in the comments, but it's something that is very in all honesty, very time consuming, especially when it's something I'm trying to explain just with words in the comments. It's still something I try and do. I'm going to try and catch up on, but I would really love to have a Q&A, because I know many of you have given me really good questions and very valid questions in healing that probably many other survivors have, but have not, chosen to actually voice for themselves. So thank you all. I'm sending my love, my prayers, my good vibes to all of you on your healing journey, and thanking you again for being here and choosing to show up for yourselves and the little selves that went through a very traumatic past. And thank you for deciding to heal, and I'm trying to send strength your way.